位，歡迎收睇26分鐘見證實錄。喺新冠肺炎期間，本地發生多宗仇恨事件入面，部分人將疫情嘅矛頭直指華裔面孔嘅人，可見針對亞裔嘅偏見喺本地有所增加。對於一啲華裔加拿大人嚟講，今次疫情引起對華人嘅偏見，令佢哋覺得自己本國人嘅身份認同受到攻擊。當中部分人無論係咪因為膚色而經歷過唔公平對待，都開始思索自己喺本國嘅位置。可否不分膚色的界限，願這土地裏不分你我高低。
用你嘅膚色嚟到判斷你嘅人，咁呢個咧係一種歧視嚟啦。
You know, this is the Chinese virus, or whatever you want to call it. I'd like to understand, okay, well, I'm open-minded. Explain to me why you have that opinion. How did you form this opinion? Why do you think an entire race is responsible for this issue? 繽紛色彩閃出的美麗，是因它沒有分開每種色彩。一場疫情令針對亞裔嘅偏見同歧視浮面，不過有加拿大華裔表示，甚至喺疫情之前就已經有局外人嘅感覺。
COVID is really just an excuse for these blatant forms of racism to rise to the surface. You know, that people can't separate your ethnicity to your heritage to your nationality. You are Chinese, or you are First Nations, or whatever group you identify with, but that doesn't mean that you're any less Canadian.
偏見點樣衝擊加拿大華裔嘅身份認同呢？
I think happens a lot to people of color is that we are asked, where are we from? Oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I'm from Canada. I'm from Salmon Arm, BC. And they're like, no, where are you really from? And that always kind of gets me a little bit because I'm like, no, I'm really from Canada. I was born in Vancouver. So it's this assumption that people of color, that they need to justify their belonging in Canadian society. It's problematic because white people are never asked this question in the same way.
喺本國出世同成長嘅華裔，唔少人曾經都對身份認同有過疑問。更加重要嘅係，成長過程中曾經被別人輕視自己嘅種族文化背景。
So you get comments like from other kids, like from my classmates, like ching ching ching, and you know they would do the things with their eyes, like oh, you know why your eyes like this.
喺本地出世、生活喺北溫哥華嘅 Catherine 陳家慧，父母喺70年代由香港移民到緬省溫尼帕，其後移居到溫哥華。Catherine 好熱衷討論感情、婚姻嘅話題，更加編寫咗一本書，講到同亞裔父母嘅相處之道。不過其實佢成長過程曾經有好大嘅身份認同危機，到長大之後先接受咗自己嘅文化背景。
When I'd go to school, I try to be as white as possible. And, you know, you'd celebrate all the occasions like Valentine's Day and Easter and things like that. And then when I'd come home, I'd almost have to take my white person hat off because my parents, you know, I spoke Cantonese with my parents, and you listen to Chinese music and you watch Chinese shows. So it was like almost like I had two identities inside the home and then outside the home. As I grew up and became a teenager, that's when you really rebel. And I really wanted to be white, so I like dyed my hair, got like colored contacts. Really listened to all like the Hollywood shows, and so I definitely struggled and rejected a lot of my culture during that time.
同樣喺本國土生土長嘅 Davina 喺 Salmon Arm 成長，父母係香港移民。佢就話，因為當地相對冇咁多機會接觸華人文化，同埋華裔喺北美電視劇、電影中鮮有名人代表，令佢曾經都有身份認同危機。
It's important because again, it validates our experiences. It reminds us that we're not alone, and it also gives us people to look up to instead of always idealizing forms of whiteness, because that's all I had growing up as a kid. All I had were different forms of white people to look up to. Although I have that privilege in relation to my parents who are immigrants, I have to acknowledge that I will always feel like an outsider. I will always, as a second generation, feel like I'm in between, like I'm never going to be Asian enough and I'm never going to be white enough.
Davina 亦都提到白人至上主義、膚色主義同冒犯少數族裔等概念嘅存在，阻礙種族平等推進。
Yeah, so I think that with the increased anti-Asian hate crimes with COVID, it's a reminder that the model minority stereotype can only get Asian people so far. So the model minority stereotype, it really teaches Asian people that, you know, it portrays us as good, right? It portrays us as good people who follow the law, who follow the rules, who don't make trouble. And it teaches us to keep our heads down and just stay silent, don't speak up, and just work really, really hard. Because white supremacy, it really teaches people of color to hate ourselves, to be ashamed of ourselves or ashamed of our culture. So, you know, that's why I went through that process growing up. And so absolutely, embracing your culture and your cultural identity is an active form of anti-racist activity. Like my parents, especially my dad, even today, he speaks to me in Cantonese. But I've always answered back in English. So I went through this really conscious process of rejecting my culture and language. And now, you know, that I'm in my mid-30s and I look back at my life, there's this real sense of shame and guilt and I think sadness over, you know, the disconnection from my culture that I now have.
而改變自己，希望融入其他人，亦都係因為自己嘅文化未被他人重視。
I think with Chinese culture, we love our food. I don't know any Asian person who doesn't love food. And so when I would bring certain things for lunch and I'd get made fun of, it really made me less proud of my culture. For example, that I'd bring like my mom would make chou for my lunch, and then I'd eat it, and then my classmates would be like, "What are you eating, worms?" And it's like you're hungry and you want to eat it, but also you're ashamed of to do that.
呢啲唔明顯但令人受傷嘅動作、言語，近年有人形容係 microaggressions 微冒犯。
Oh, you're not really Chinese because you don't speak the language. You know, my parents were saying when they were growing up, it was all about being fresh off the boat or being called bananas because, you know, the color of our skin, we're still Asian on the outside, but really inside, you know, we're not fully Asian because we don't always speak in Chinese.
同樣喺本國土生土長嘅蔣正嫻 Laura Ann 喺疫情發生之前，亦都經歷過一啲微冒犯事件，令佢覺得社會上仍然有唔少偏見。
I recently had one incident on Instagram where I had posted a picture that said I was proud to be Chinese, and it was just a picture of me in traditional Chinese clothing and just celebrating my Asian heritage. And it was a very demeaning comment. It was obviously from someone as well who didn't necessarily attack just Chinese, but all Asian races, and they kind of combined it into one comment. And so that was really hurtful for me. And when you start hearing things growing up, you either, you know, you learn to deal with it and figure out a more domestic way of like answering, or, you know, it gets at you and it starts to eat at you and you start to believe things that, you know, maybe you're not as entitled or not as deserving as someone else who is of a different race. And if we complain about them, they think, oh, you're just being too sensitive. Like, I was just joking. There's always an excuse behind it.
有個 term maskophobia, right? Maskophobia. 所以佢初咧就好多西人咧見到唐人戴口罩咧就唔中意，佢哋會好驚。跟住咧，而家如果見到唐人唔戴口罩咧，都一樣有個影響，所以 we can't win。
喺疫情期間，曾經經歷2次微冒犯事件嘅葉萍萍，覺得即使係細微嘅事件，都會造成傷害。
唔係好 obvious， 唔係 black and white， 你睇唔出㗎。係有時有人或者做咗任何嘢 ，and then afterwards 你覺得 I don't feel good，but what was that？ What happened？ 咁如果多啲人出聲咧，多啲人講就。我唔會話咁諗，哦，係咪我太 sensitive 啊？或者可能佢唔係 ，he didn't mean that。OK，but 我覺得好多時咧，呢啲 microaggression 都係有啲 meaning 啊。
Like commenting on your eyes or something like that, saying open your eyes. But But if that one person just says it once in a while, but then you have to think about how many times is that person also hearing it from other people saying it every once in a while, you know? And then it's when it starts adding up that it really starts to get to you.
其實新冠肺炎發生之前 Davina 已經經歷過幾次種族歧視。咁除咗一次喺美國因為未有理會街上人搭訕而被指佢需要學英文之外，專業係社工嘅佢喺工作嘅時候，亦都曾經2次因為自己嘅膚色而被他人質疑。
My client, she actually told her brother all of these racist things about me, and then he proceeded to say that he wanted to work with a white person instead of me. So that was one incident. Another incident that happened at work is that I was actually in the reception area of our clinic. I was talking with my client, and then somebody else in the reception area, a member of the public, he interjected himself into our conversation. And he went on this tirade about how he is from here and I'm not from here.
有一年咧，香港嘅移民嚟105萬幾個。如果同佢未曾知道你係邊度嚟，或者係咪土生有咩而講呢句説話嘅話咧，即係佢 assume 咗你就係如果有膚色嘅人都係喺出邊嚟㗎啦。但係咧，如果嗰個人咁同我講嘅話咧，我會問翻你，不如你又再去翻你自己嚟嘅地方啦，因為大家都知道咧，係白人都係從第二度嚟㗎，都係移民過嚟嘅所謂嘅。不過就佢哋嘅時間可能比較長啲。
咩叫話嚟咗50幾年？我嚟咗60年。咁但係咧就我見過係加拿大嘅轉變係轉變咗好多，即係60年代嗰陣時咧，就我哋主要咧就係雙語言、雙文化 multilingualism 同 biculturalism 啦。咁到70年代咧，咁啊政府嗰陣時咧 Trudeau 咧佢 Trudeau Senior 咧就要整個多元文化，即係要表示我哋加拿大咧係一個唔係淨係一個熔爐，即係美國咧得個大熔爐一個 melting pot， 但係加拿大咧可以俾你自由發展，係接受多元文化嘅。所以我哋有多元文化政策係加拿大，全世界係我哋第一個國家，加拿大咧係有個多元文化嘅 Multiculturalism Act。咁係有一路轉變，一路係對於社會方面咧係對於種族華方面咧係好有推進嘅，好有效力嘅。咁但係始終都係歧視方面咧係始終都有，但係希望我哋政府3級政府能夠多啲做啲功夫。
咁其實有部分人將新冠肺炎同華人畫上等號嘅做法，不但無助戰勝病毒，更加係加劇種族偏見。咁教國推崇嘅多元文化點樣受到挑戰呢？下一節翻嚟我哋繼續了解。本國推崇多元文化，唔同種族嘅人可以共融相處。咁但係一場疫症就令偏見同歧視浮面，令一啲華裔加拿大人開始思考身份認同同系統性種族歧視等嘅問題。咁點樣做可以改善種族和諧呢
？You can see how try different samples of their food and their culture and things, the way they dance.
Lauren 準正嫻係第3代加拿大華裔，佢嘅父母都係喺本國出世嘅華裔。咁一家人好熱衷了解自己嘅背景同中華文化，甚至會保留一啲好特別嘅物件。好似係家族族譜。
Yeah, this is just history of the family, and then the tree starts and it branches out, and this is where at the page where my husband's name is in.
It talks about the characteristics of our family, what our family valued, and
甚至係家訓。
You know, one of the ancient sayings is that for Chinese, we are all one family, and as one family, we should be proud of ourselves. As we were growing up as kids, you know, we'd go to English elementary schools and things like that, really giving up a lot of our heritage or not really learning much about our heritage and just trying to fit into a Western culture.
I mean, I was actually born on Canada Day. So it's like, no, for me, I've always grown up believing I'm, 100% Canadian. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. If you're born in Canada, you're you're Canadian, you know? So when it comes to my nationality, yeah, I always say I'm Canadian. But of course, in terms of my heritage and ethnicity, I am Chinese. I'm 100% Chinese.
事實上，佢哋嘅家族早喺上世紀就由中國廣東省移居到溫哥華。
So this is a book about Vancouver Chinese and the early years in Vancouver and how it became. And we were looking through it, and we actually found a section about the canneries and salmon fishing. And then, Mommy, you want to explain that one?
This is a picture of my grandfather, who had come to Canada first, and that's why my mother was actually born here.
媽媽何淑芬嘅祖父蔣安順喺20年代嚟到加拿大，並定居喺當時被稱為義埠嘅新西敏，主要喺罐頭廠工作。而蔣安順爸爸嘅兄弟蔣內更加早喺1882年就由中國到新西敏進行修建加拿大太平洋鐵路嘅工作。呢一啲歷史以往好少由家人提起，透過一個親戚收集而成嘅資料，佢哋先知道家族歷史。
But I did not know the story of growing up in Vancouver as a Canadian Chinese born and our whole history in Chinatown and Vancouver and Chinese. You know, I don't think either one of us really ever knew much about that growing up.
加拿大太平洋鐵路喺1885年完成之後，同年本國通過華人移民法案，向進入加拿大嘅華人收取人頭稅，希望借此壓止華人移民。Lorraine 嘅曾祖父亦都曾經繳交過人頭稅。該項帶有歧視嘅法案到1947年被廢除，而聯邦政府亦都喺2006年就呢件事正式道歉並提供賠償。
各位嘉賓、各位朋友，加拿大講對唔住。我哋華裔又好，其他族裔又好，最大嘅得着咧就係話加拿大政府咧一嬲以嚟咧都係推廣呢個多元文化嘅，希望其他族裔我哋大家和洽共處嘅。
When people start becoming targeting and making racist comments against any group, whether it's Chinese or Japanese or South Asians, you know, it doesn't make sense, right? Because everybody contributed and helped make what it is we know as a city that we all love to live in. But it's just hurtful when you hope that we are beyond that, because we've been talking multiculturalism for so long.
已經喺加拿大生活半世紀嘅葉吳美琪同葉成基相信，以往加拿大歧視華人嘅歷史，時至今日都對大眾對華人嘅睇法有影響。
100幾十年前咁有人話歧視華人，因為窮啊，啲孤兒嚟到啊，起鐵路啊，洗衫啊。咁嗰種歧視咧冇錢，
人頭稅啊，即係嗰啲所謂呢個 Chinese exclusion 啊，即係完全期唔俾華人嚟移民啊呢種咁嘅法例嚟到喎，就係已經形成咗好多本地人咧，就嗰個從細到大都覺得嚟講喺呢個社會入邊咧係華人係低等啲，或者華人係唔係好受歡迎。
各種嘅歧視其實亦都喺少數族裔之間存在，唔同種族之間亦都唔應該以有色眼鏡看待。
For example, George Floyd, he was murdered. 4 police officers were involved. 2 of them were people of color. One of them was actually an Asian person. And there's a lot of discrimination that happens, from Chinese people towards Black people and Indigenous people. And this is exactly how white supremacy continues to thrive. By dividing and conquering people of color. Yeah, I truly believe that we would not be having this wide discussion about racism if it wasn't for the intersection of increased anti-Asian hate crimes because of COVID and also the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think this is a very important example of how a powerful allyship across different communities can be.
過去加拿大華裔先民嘅貢獻、犧牲，一段段可貴嘅歷史，可以點樣承傳落去呢？
I would say the education is better because a lot of them are passed away, and we like the children to know what's going on.
You know, we hear about, the Minister of Education right now reaching out to the Black community to incorporate more Black history into the curriculum. Well, that may be good. However, I don't think we should ignore the predominant ethnic groups that are already in British Columbia, such as the Chinese history. That really isn't taught.
I remember learning a lot about our First Nations communities, but in terms of the Chinese history in Vancouver, I don't really remember a whole lot about it. You know, there might have been one unit, 1 year or something like that, which isn't enough to stick with someone and for them to really respect those communities. If you're going to do a portion on Black history, then you're also definitely going to have to include some Chinese history in there, because especially because the Chinese people were here before Vancouver was even a city. So how can you not educate our youngsters about the history of Vancouver, when the history of Vancouver started with Chinese people and First Nations people? So that's one thing that I hope that is included, and just continue to grow a diverse population.
華裔家庭透過教育下一代，又會否啟發更多種族議題嘅討論呢？
If you grow up with the right core values and you're taught that people are people, and we are the human race, we're not one race attacking another race and one race is better than the other. If you grow up thinking that everyone is equal and we're all able to help each other, then no matter what the media says, you're not going to believe it.
I remember there were Chinese, like they mentioned that there were Chinese workers that worked on the railway, but that head tax and the discrimination and I think it was actually my dad because my dad worked for the railway system. And so he was actually the one who told me that they would send the Chinese workers into really dangerous areas, and if something happened to them, it's like kind of they were. It didn't really matter, I guess, back in the day. Loving who you are and embracing your own culture, which is something that I struggled with growing up. A lot of it, people associate their parents with their culture. And I think having, as we get older, and as, for me, when I became a mom, I really started reflecting on that relationship with my parents, and trying to understand my own culture and where I came from made me work on my relationship with my parents more, because they're the ones that are going to tell you the things that they've experienced, and that, their history and where you came from, and, your ancestors and all that stuff. And so having good communication and, having raw and honest conversations with our parents is going to be very helpful during this time. Teaching our kids to be proud of their culture and teaching them to love themselves in the way that I've taught them, I think it will help change the future, and it's actually going to be a brighter future than it was.
多元文化喺本國又可以點樣推進呢？
你多元文化啊嘛，我做我自己嘅，冇錯，你可以。同時嚟講，你都冇忘記，當你自己嘅行為、你自己習俗有侵犯到人哋嘅時候，咁你就要小心啲啦。呢個就係人哋侵犯你唔啱。但係你侵犯人哋都唔啱。係咯，
譬如我喺入籍法庭，我做成20幾年啦，咁即係見過好多新移民，由新移民到佢夠時間入籍之後喺度融合社會。咁每次入籍嗰陣時咧，嗰啲法官我哋個法官都係好有耐心，好有愛心。話俾你聽，我哋加拿大係一種咁嘅國家，係一種多元文化嘅國家。咁所以你哋真係好彩嚟到加拿大佢選擇加拿大做你新嘅家園。但係另一方面咧，加拿大亦都好彩，因為你哋接受你嚟呢度，因為我哋加拿大需要你哋啲人有知識，有經濟能力，或者有咩才能。咁我哋大家要彼此，我哋接受你哋加拿大。接受你嚟，咁你哋咧就貢獻翻俾加拿大。咁所以大家如果諗起咧，咁嘅前提之下咧，我哋做加拿大人咧，一定係好驕傲，一定要為加拿大着想，為加拿大推進呢個多元文化、種族和諧。
As a second-generation person who's also a social worker by profession, it is my professional and personal duty to continue advocating for racial equality.
好啦，今集嘅節目時間又差唔多啦。如果觀眾對我哋嘅節目有任何意見嘅話，歡迎以電郵嘅方式同我哋聯絡。我哋嘅電郵地址係 mag26@fairchildtv.com。咁觀眾亦都可以上網睇返今集嘅節目內容。我哋嘅網址係3W.fairchildtv.com。多謝收睇，下星期再見。